Hello and welcome to the second episode all about Ireland and the First World War. My name is Gabrielle McMaster. I am an author and historian. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at how the First World War impacted Ireland. Within this, we're going to be looking at the Home Rule crisis. We're going to be looking at the divisions that came out of Ireland to fight in the First World War. And finally, we will also be looking at the lasting legacy of the First World War within Ireland. At the time, just before the outbreak of the First World War, Ireland was extremely divided over the Home Rule crisis. This crisis divided Ireland into two. You had the Unionists on one half and the Nationalists on the other. Unionists were generally deemed to be led by Sir Edward Carson and Captain James Craig. They were very much against Home Rule. A lot of the propaganda at the time which they themselves were spreading amongst the people was Home Rule or Rome Rule. That was the main slogan because they seen Home Rule as very much being ruled by Rome or the Vatican because they wanted to remain British. Nationalists, on the other hand, were led by John Redmond. They wanted Home Rule. At the time, they seen Home Rule as being a self-identity for them, that they were Irish and they wanted Ireland to be ruled by Ireland. They did not want the involvement of Britain within their affairs. Both sides were very much willing to fight this out and eventually to go to the stage of being ready to fight in a civil war with each other. On the part of the Unionists, they had built up a lot of propaganda around this, and one of the biggest propaganda pieces in 1912 was, of course, the Ulster Covenant. The Ulster Covenant was this declaration to try and keep Ireland British. Sir Edward Carson was the first one to sign it in 1912 in Belfast City Hall. This attracted a lot of people within their own towns to sign the Ulster Covenant. They did not have to travel to Belfast for this, they could sign it within their own town. It is rumoured that a lot of people, including Sir Edward Carson, signed it in his own blood, although this is debated among historians as to whether this is actually true or whether, once again, it is this piece of propaganda that surrounded the whole Home Rule crisis at the time. On the other side of the equation, the Nationalists, they themselves were also building and getting ready to fight the Civil War. They had their own newspapers which were spreading their personal propaganda, but at the same time, both sides were prepping weapons. They were prepping weapons to go for a civil war. Now, while this sounds like a dark and dreary time within Ireland, it must be remembered about the treatment of Catholics within factories and the shipyards at the time. It was not a safe place for Catholics to be. While the shipyards are always deemed to be full of this wondrous work that they did with the Olympic and the Titanic around this time, the main issue underlying it was in fact that the treatment in the workplace was awful. No one should have been treated like that over a political crisis. The Catholics did not feel safe in their own workplaces. A lot of them ended up being out of work because of this and unemployed, and this fueled this desire for Home Rule. They wanted to be ruled by Ireland because perhaps then they would have had fairer treatment. This allowed for them to justify going for this civil war. So it was very much a mixed time of both sides justifying their own take with this Home Rule crisis. Of course, at the time, there were events which did bring the two sides together, and I think it is important as a historian to remember this. So at the time, you had the Titanic and the Olympic launches. The Titanic launch was not just 1912, but also 1911, and in fact the 1911 launch was bigger in Belfast than the 1912 launch in Belfast. This event was not about dividing Unionists and Nationalists, Catholics and Protestants. This event was actually divided by class, and that is something that will be in another episode later on. But it is important to remember that the class divide played more of a role in these events than the political divide. But once again, after these events were over, we went back into this political divide. So Ireland, prior to the First World War outbreak, was extremely divided in the political sense. When the war broke out, the Unionists under Sir Edward Carson and Captain James Craig rallied their troops and wanted them to fight in this war. But they actually wanted them to fight in this war because they seen it as a fight for the British Crown, to show their loyalty. Rather than seeing it as defending their country, they seen it as specifically this political idealism. The Ulster Volunteer Force, which were more than willing and ready to go for a civil war against the Nationalists, they were called up and expected to join the war effort. This just showed how much they were willing to put this propaganda into the ordinary men. And this is something you see throughout the wars in general, that propaganda plays the main role within men wanting to join up. And this, once again, specifically under Unionism, was seen as this fight against Home Rule rather than the fight for Ireland and for the safety of the country and the people that lived within it. The Nationalists under John Redmond were very much 50-50 at this time. John Redmond had to persuade his troops to actually sign up. He tried to tell them that it was not a fight for the British Crown, it was a fight for Home Rule. That if they fought in this war, they would prove themselves to be able to have Home Rule. A lot of posters at the time for Nationalists to sign up had a cartoon picture of John Redmond's face, and on it did state that before you could have your Home Rule, you had to have a part in ending the war. Some people, these are known as radicals among the historical side of things, broke away because they'd seen it as a war for the British Crown, and this did not change. We will be revisiting this radical group later on in the episode, but for now I want to look at the three divisions which came out of Ireland to fight in this war. So the main divisions were the 10th Irish, the 16th Irish, and the 36th Ulster. The 10th Irish were formed in August 1914, and they were based more for the Eastern Front. Now in 1915, some of them were called over to the Western Front because of the shortage of men. This was actually prior to the Somme, because the Somme was in 1916, so the shortage of men was already prevalent within the First World War a year before the Somme. We can imagine what is going to happen, which will be addressed later in the episode as well. The 16th Irish and 36th Ulster, they were based on the Western Front. Now at the time, and still now, there is this idea that the 36th Ulster were all Protestant, all Unionist, and the 16th Irish were all Nationalist and Catholic. You did have some people that were the opposite in each group. This is something that is not really addressed enough, that you did have some Nationalists in the 36th Ulster. You did have some Unionists in the 16th Irish. But while these two sides were ready to go for civil war against each other prior to the First World War starting, they ended up living and fighting and dying alongside each other within this war. For the 36th Ulster, the main battle for them was of course the Battle of the Somme. It is seen as this idea of men in orange collarettes going over the top screaming no surrender. There were no orange collarettes worn by the 36th Ulster Division on the Battle of the Somme. That has been refuted many times, and it is something that I want to emphasise now, that that was not the case. Alongside this, while it is seen as a battle for the 36th Ulster Division, the 16th Irish fought and died alongside these men on the first day. It was not just the 36th Ulster Division, and that once again is something that needs to be addressed and neutralised within Irish history. At the same time, Passchendaele is seen as a battle for the 16th Irish Division, yet it is not as well remembered, and in fact it is known as Ireland's forgotten battle today because no one remembers Passchendaele, but everyone remembers the Somme. perhaps with this neutralisation that is trying to take place in Irish history, these battles and the sacrifices that these other men made just might be remembered. Now, the 36th Ulster Division did fight alongside the 16th Irish in Passchendaele, but it is not seen as this great and wonderful battle for unionism as the Somme is. I just think that that is ridiculous and that needs to be taken out. Both of these men need to be remembered for the sacrifices that they made. The divided land should not and did not come into the First World War. It did not go into the trenches. They remain very much on friendly and good terms compared with the way it was prior to the First World War breaking out. So while we have addressed the myths and legends within these battles, which of course, like the Somme, will be addressed later on within these episodes, I now want to look at the radicals that broke away from John Redmond's nationalists. So these rebels that broke away, they decided to keep up this fight for home rule. They decided to continue to prepare and get ready for a rising against the British. As I'm sure a lot of you listening to this will probably immediately know what is going to happen. And of course that is going to be the Easter Rising of 1916. Now what fueled it was a lot of the situation that was happening within the First World War at the time. The lack of men was becoming an issue. They thought that the British government and the British Army would be very distracted and would not be too concerned about the situation happening within Ireland at the time. So they decided to start to stage their rebellion and made strongholds throughout Dublin City. Of course, the British government were not too distracted and they did send troops that were stationed in Ireland at the time to go and fight against them. Now, the issue with this is that some of the men who were sent to fight for the British government against these rebels may have actually been the brothers that decided to break off from their families to go and fight in the war, because they seen the war as providing them with more money and to protect their family, while one brother or one father or one son would have stayed to fight for the independence of Ireland at the time. So we had this situation within Ireland where families were fighting against each other when this rebellion broke out. Not every troop that had to be sent to Dublin was one of the family members of some of the men fighting. There were some Englishmen as well that ended up fighting too. Women actually took part in this rising and they are very much washed out of this history because for some of them, if say they had come from Ireland before and they moved over to England or Scotland, some of them did come back over to fight in this rebellion. And I find that very admirable that these women felt so strongly about their homeland that they would give up their lives to come back over and fight. Now, those that did end up fighting in the rebellion from Dublin also, when it was over, just went back to their lives. They were beginning to be arrested and some women were arrested and sent on prison ships, but not all of them. And once the arrests and the roundups started happening, they did just escape and go back to their ordinary lives. And I would love for more of a history to actually be given to these women and the sacrifices that they made that have been very much washed out of the history of the Easter Rising. As we do know, the British government and the British Army were not too distracted at this time. The rising was put down. Had the rebels waited until perhaps July 1916, would they have succeeded? Because of course the Somme happened, more men were needed, conscription was introduced. Of course conscription was not introduced in Ireland and we'll go into that in a little minute, but they needed as many men as they could over on the Western Front when the Somme took place. They did not expect it to be such a massacre. So if the rebels had have waited until July and the Somme had happened and took their chance then, would things have turned out differently? That is something that you can think about and you can come to your own conclusion about. But I think it is one of those very interesting questions in history as to the what if. That is something that is good to think about and good to analyse within the historical context of the time. Now, before we look at the aftermath of the war, within Ireland. The conscription that was introduced in 1916 by the British government was not introduced in Ireland. It was introduced in Scotland, England, Wales, but not Ireland. The reason for this is that the British government thought that by introducing conscription, Ireland would be sent into a civil war because they were forcing people to fight for the British crown, and they knew that that would end up causing a civil war to end up happening against the British, and the British knew that they could not fight a civil war in Ireland, a war on the Western Front and a war on the Eastern Front. They did not have the men to do that. So the British government made the very important and, I believe, the most sensible decision as to not introduce conscription into Ireland in 1916. They relied simply on the volunteers within Ireland itself to fight this war. And because they had introduced conscription into Scotland, England, Wales, it helped with numbers, but even if they were struggling, they did not want to risk conscription in Ireland. And if you did not know that little fact, there is a little fact for you that conscription was never once introduced in Ireland during the First World War, even though it was still under British rule. Now we come to the end of the war in this very quick overview of Ireland and the First World War. So when the men came home, it was very much still divided society. So Unionist regiments and Nationalist regiments were not as well celebrated as perhaps the idealism is. So some people do believe that all these bands came out to welcome them home. That was not the case whatsoever. In fact, there is only one battalion that is deemed to have been celebrated within the 36th Ulster Division, but apart from that, none of the others were celebrated or welcomed back. For those that fought on the nationalist side of this about to break out civil war that happened before the First World War, they came home from fighting in the First World War and they were deemed as traitors by their own families, by their own neighbours and by their own people because they fought in this war. This led to a lot of the World War I veterans actually being shunned and ostracised within their own communities. Some of them even ended up murdered. This was the reality of the divided land of Ireland at the time of the First World War. In order to understand why this was the case in the aftermath of the war, you really did need to understand the Home Rule crisis, and I hope that I have helped you to at least have a brief understanding of that. So I hope you enjoyed this episode all about Ireland and the First World War, and if you did, please do subscribe. I will be doing more episodes on the First World War, including women in the First World War, and even the Battle of the Somme itself. So if you are looking forward to any of those, please subscribe and you will be notified when the next episode goes live. Within these episodes, I'm also hoping to do film history, World War II history, Cold War history, and if there's anything else you would like, perhaps leave a comment. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time.